Genesis, Bereshit is about creation. The creation of our planet, the creation of humanity, and the creation of our people. We go from darkness, from there being nothing, to being on the verge of becoming our own culture and community. We see the complexities of families. Here we get some of our absolute favorite characters, from Adam and Eve to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, all these names that sound really familiar, and Joseph, Noah, the list goes on and on and on. Here we get some of our most heartfelt, heart-wrenching, and complicated stories about family dynamics and our relationship with God. This is where Noah and the flood happens, where Adam, Eve, and the apple happens, where Joseph goes off to Egypt and has wild, magnificent dreams. We see the beauty and the richness of who we are as a people starting to form in this book, all about creation. Asking which story speaks to me in the book of Genesis is like asking the mother of 40 children to pick her favorite. There are so many incredible stories. In fact, I might argue that the majority of our compelling and incredible and complicated stories are existing all right here at the beginning. I'm going to go for my namesake, Rachel. Because we see through Rachel, as we see actually through all the protagonists in this book of Genesis, that people are very complicated. Nobody is perfect. The people that we aspire to be like, that we model all of our values after, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, Noah, Joseph, Adam, Eve, none of them are perfect. All of them are flawed. And we see in this story of Rachel with her sister Leah, with her love Jacob, that everybody is doing their best. And that sometimes families are extremely complicated. And that sometimes when we've been wronged or when we are being controlled by others, the best thing that we can offer is our forgiveness. And there's one particular point in the book of Genesis where Rachel and Leah steal the idols of their father Laban before they leave with their husband Jacob. And I love this moment because I see two strong women asserting their autonomy in the way that they can in a situation that is totally out of their control. And also seeing that while they are now part of the genesis of a people who do not worship idols, right? Baseline, that is who we are, is we believe in one God, and that's already forming. That is the start of Abraham's relationship with God. By the time we get to Jacob, it's a core part of what separates us from peoples around us. And yet here are Rachel and Leah, our matriarchs, taking the idols of their father with them. Why? I've always been so compelled by this because it is such a moment of humanity, to show that sometimes our values can go in contrast with what feels familiar, with what feels like home, with what feels like a reminder of where we came from. And that as Jews, we contain multitudes, that we aspire to be the best version of ourselves, and we also recognize that we carry wherever we came from with us throughout our entire lives.
book of Exodus begins by hearing that a new Pharaoh has arisen who has forgotten about Joseph. The stories of our fathers and mothers from the book of Genesis are long forgotten. The generosity and the wisdom of Joseph is forgotten, and instead, this new tyrant, the Pharaoh, has arisen, and this tyrant is fearful. He's fearful that the Jewish people is growing stronger and numerous, and so he wonders, how can I suppress these people? And so the book of Exodus begins with that oppression of making the Jewish people into slaves, of slaughtering through an attempted genocide all the baby boys so that the people wouldn't be able to propagate, and of moving into years and years and years of servitude and pain. And as the book continues, we hear, of course, about the Savior, the one who will bring us redemption. Moses, who is born a slave, but ultimately raised in the palace, who has the background of us all, but also the knowledge of what freedom could look like. Moses' moral compass ultimately leads him to leave that palace life, to flee into the desert, and to find himself and to find God. When Moses encounters God in the form of a burning bush, God tells Moses, "Go back and free my people." And of course, Moses goes back, and the famous story continues of the 10 plagues, of the asking and begging of Pharaoh to let my people go. Ultimately, after plague and plague and plague, the Pharaoh relents, and Moses and Miriam and Aaron lead the people off through the split waters of the sea and into freedom. The remainder of the book of Exodus, that's actually only the first bit, will continue to tell the story of who we were in the desert, of how we encountered God, and how we learned of God's rules, and how we figured out through all of those years of wandering what it is to be a free people. Effectively, that is the book of Exodus. One of the stories in the book of Exodus that always touches my heart and that I think about this year on this Simchat Torah is the story of the midwives. We hear towards the beginning of the book that Pharaoh has told the Egyptian midwives that they must, when they deliver Hebrew babies, slaughter the boys. Allow the girls to live, but slaughter the boys. And we hear about these two women. They're called Hamyaldot Ha'ivriot, which could mean Hebrew midwives or midwives to the Hebrews, depending how you read it. We hear of these two women, Shifra and Pua, who engage in the world's first act of civil disobedience. They hear the all-powerful Pharaoh say to commit murder, and they refuse. They come up with a crazy story saying, "Oh, it's not that we didn't follow your orders, it's that those women give birth so quickly. There's nothing we could possibly do about it." But ultimately recorded within this story is an act of resistance, of saying that just because we're told to do something doesn't make it right. Now, we could read it two ways, as I said. They could be Egyptian women, or they could be Hebrew women. I like to think that they're actually Egyptian women, that they are midwives to the Hebrews, and that you see these two women, Shifra and Pua, who, even though they're part of that dominant, powerful culture, they know there's something wrong, and in their own way, they stand up for justice because their moral compass leads them to do so. I feel that this is one of the most inspiring stories in the book of Exodus. The lesson from the story of the midwives, whether they be Egyptian or whether they be Hebrew, is that we have to speak truth to power, that we have to fight for freedom, that we have to look around our society, and just because things are a certain way doesn't mean it's just. Just because we're told to do things doesn't mean we should. We have to question each order, each rule, each precedent, and say, is this true justice? Is this what God would want of me? We hear that the midwives were God-fearing. They stood in awe of the divine. They knew that there was something so much more powerful than Pharaoh or than what they were told. And so on Simchat Torah, when I think of the book of Exodus, the book of Shemot, I think of this unspeakable courage to say that justice demands of us to see more than the present moment and to be who God dreams we could be.
Well, the book of Leviticus is one of the more difficult books to understand, but if you put it in the context of the Torah itself, it makes perfect sense. Remember that the Bible starts out in the Garden of Eden, and because of the negative actions of Adam and Eve, they are cast out. The story of the Torah is actually a return to the garden. And it really happens with the building of the Mishkan, the building of the portable tabernacle. And the question that the book of Leviticus is attempting to answer is, how do you live in the garden with God? How do you take up residence with God? And so if you look at the first word of the book of Leviticus, it's Vayikra. And God called. This is a book about relationship. This isn't simply a book about sacrifices and the handbook of the priest. Vayikra is a call. God's calling to us. Our response is in the ritual of sacrifices. That was the common practice of the day. But the underlying principle of the book is really about how can we be in relationship with God. And so the word korban in Hebrew, that's the word for sacrifice. It really means, how do I come close to God? How do I find that way? And whether we do it at the altar in the temple or we offer our own personal prayers, we're always trying to get back to God and that relationship and respond to that call. Well, the book of Leviticus doesn't actually have a lot of great stories. It's not like the book of Genesis or Exodus, Numbers or Deuteronomy. It's, as I said, it's really all about the sacrifice. But what speaks to me is the portion of Kedoshim. Because if we're going to learn how to live in proximity to God, we also have to learn how to live in proximity to each other, and that's where the portion of Kedoshim, the holiness code, comes in. And there are a whole variety of ethical laws there that really speak to me. Most of all, it's the command, V'ahavta l'reacha chamocha, to love your neighbor as yourself. This is a remarkable, remarkable text in the history of humankind. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor because they're like you, which is really what the words mean, speaks to me about going back to the very beginning of the Torah again, just as we talked about the Garden of Eden. What distinguishes humanity from any other animal? that each of us are created b'tselem Elohim, that each of us are created in the image of God. And so the underlying principle of v'ahavta l'reacha chamocha, to love your neighbor as yourself, is to see the image of God in each and every person and respond to it by affording each and every person the dignity that they each deserve simply by being created in the image of God. The enduring lesson in the portion of Kedoshim is that we can be more than we are. We can actually fulfill the idea that God lays out for us. We can create a Garden of Eden in our own right. We can remake the world in such a way that it would be a place fitting not only for each of us and the best of ourselves, but it's also a place where God would want to dwell with us. This, to me, is the basis of the idea of the redemption, the Geula. And unlike other religions that wait for a Messiah that is on the Messiah's own time clock, in this story, in the story of Leviticus, in the story of the Torah, in the story of Kedoshim, we are the determinants. If we embrace not only the moral and ethical teachings of Torah, if we embrace the best of our tradition, if we also learn to relate to each other as God seeks, as beings created in the image of God, then we have the possibility of also bringing redemption.
So it is really hard to pick one story in the book of Numbers. There's a lot going on here. My bat mitzvah portion is from this book. It's called Be'ahalotcha, and I share it with multiple family members. And it is rich in many lessons and stories. But I think I'm going to go with a story from a different part. That's the story of the daughters of Tzlofachad. There are 5 sisters whose father passes away. And this could put them in a very precarious position as women. There were no sons because they could be just left to fend for themselves. And as women, they were not allowed to own property. However, they had the gumption to approach Moses together and challenge this law. And the ruling ultimately was in their favor. While they could not actually own the property, they could still be sort of placeholders for the property. And as long as they married within their tribe, that property would remain in their family. And that is a story that really sticks with me. So the daughters of Tzlofachad have a really strong and enduring lesson for us today. As I said, they banded together, they showed unity, and they questioned authority. They were claiming their space, which is terminology that we use today, but that is exactly what they were doing. They shone a light on unfairness in their time and inequality. This is the beauty of Torah in general, really. These are timeless lessons that continually remind us to turn our study into action. And these daughters of Tzlofechad still inspire me, and I hope inspire many, many people to really look at things that have been practiced and say, maybe we should change that. Maybe the reality requires us to re-examine what's going on here. And the daughters of Tzlofechad did that in their time, and that's something that we still need to do today.
Welcome to the last book. We are in book number 5. You have made it, the book of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy. This book is also called the Mishneh Torah, which means the second Torah. The reason it's called that is because there are a lot of mitzvot, a lot of commandments, and a lot of stories that are repeated in this book of Devarim that appeared in the 4 earlier books. Sometimes there are the same mitzvot that are exactly written the same way. More often than not, the commandments show up in a bit of a different way. They are changed, or laws are added or modified or subtracted. And sometimes we hear stories that have a bit of a different take or opinion on how they happened earlier. There are a few things about the book of Devarim that I think are really worth noting, that I think are really cool. So one is the names of the final Torah portions. As we get to the end of the book, we read about one Torah portion, which title is Ki Teitzeh, and the next title is Ki Tavo. So one title is As You Are Going Out, and Ki Tavo, meaning as you come back. The next Torah portion is Nitzavim Vayelech, which means as we are standing and as we are walking, as we are moving forward. The next one is Ha'azinu, that we are meant to listen. And the final one, V'zot HaBracha, to this blessing. If we take even just the names of each of the Torah portions, I believe it is meant to give us this nice send-off, this nice blessing as we are finishing the book. The last Torah portions put together are Ki Teitzeh Ki Tavo, as you leave and as you come back. Nitzavim Vayelech, whether you are standing or you are moving forward. Ha'azinu V'zot HaBracha, listen to this very blessing. I believe that those names of the portions are not necessarily accidental, though maybe they are. But when they are strung together, they are meant to tell us that as we finish the Torah, wherever we go or when we come back, if we feel like we're stuck or we're moving forward, that we are meant to listen to this very blessing that Moses gives to us. At the very end of the Torah, Moses dies and he has this last mitzvah, this last commandment. The last commandment that Moses tells us is that we are each meant to write a Sefer Torah. We are each meant to write a scroll of the Torah. And I think that is meant to actually reflect this very holiday that we celebrate, this holiday of Simchat Torah. That as we finish the Torah, Moses is telling us, you think you're coming to the end? You got to go back to the beginning. You have to go and write yourself one of these books. It's so important for you to write your own scroll. And we live that out on Simchat Torah, maybe not with writing, but just as we finish the Torah reading, just as we finish the book of Devarim, what do? We go back to Breshit. We go back to the beginning. We go to the book of Genesis. So what I find particularly poignant about the end of the Torah, as we get to the end of Devarim, you guys have made it to the finish, that as we end it, what we know is that we are actually going right back to the beginning. So I hope as you get to hear the end of Devarim today, on Simchat Torah, that you will remember this about this book, that it's the last book of the Torah. It sums up things we've already heard. It might change or modify some laws or stories. That the final series of Torah portions are here to tell us that wherever we go or whenever we come back, or if we're stuck standing or if we're moving forward, we're always meant to have blessing. And finally, on Simchat Torah, what we are meant to do is, just as we finish this book of the Torah, just as we finish all of hearing about the entire Torah, all year we've spent reading from this Torah, we are so excited to go back to the beginning and start all over again. Wishing you and your family a Chag Sameach.
Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai.